Philadelphia in the winter of 1881 was a city of profound contrasts. The frigid air cut through the snow-covered streets, as if the city itself were frozen in time, waiting for something. The shops with their illuminated windows, the smoke rising from the chimneys, and the noise of the carriages were the daily reality for people hurrying past, seeking the safety of their homes or the comfort of the heated shops. But for Elliot, the streets seemed colder than ever. At 12 years old, the boy had already seen more than any child should. He lost his parents when he was only 5, in a fire that devastated the family's old home, a tragedy that was never fully solved. The fire destroyed everything, including the life of an innocent child. Since then, Elliot has lived in St. Anne's Orphanage, a place that, despite offering shelter and food, was never able to heal the emptiness he carried within himself. Elliot didn't know what had happened in that fire, but he felt with all his being that someone was behind it, someone powerful enough to never be held accountable. Justice, in his mind, was a luxury only the rich could afford. He had no resources, no proof, but the feeling that something was deeply wrong never left him. The city, with its riches and thriving businesses, seemed to ignore those who, like him, were forgotten and abandoned. One morning, while walking through the city streets, Elliot saw Jonathan Blackwell for the first time. The man was stepping out of a golden carriage accompanied by 2 servants. Blackwell was one of Philadelphia's wealthiest and most influential businessmen, with a fortune stemming from the coal and iron industries which were booming at the time. He had the kind of face that resembled a predator. His expensive clothes and haughty gait showed that he was a man who dominated not only the city, but also the law itself. For Elliot, Blackwell was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world. A man so detached from his suffering that it seemed impossible to believe that justice could ever reach him. In the following days, Elliot discreetly followed Blackwell, observing his routine and trying to find any clue that could link the businessman to the fire that had destroyed his life. He knew he was acting on instinct, but his desire for revenge compelled him not to give up. For weeks, he hid in the shadows, watching Blackwell's carriages depart from and arrive at his mansion. He felt his blood boil every time he saw the businessman. Elliot was obsessed. However, the city wasn't limited to Blackwell and his empire. Far away, at the orphanage, Elliot found solace in his friendship with other orphans. But this friendship was never enough to heal what he felt. The emptiness left by the fire, the lack of answers, and the feeling that justice would not be served. Among the orphans there were William Hayes William, a childhood friend of Elliot's. They grew up together in the orphanage, but after William joined the police force, their paths diverged. Elliot knew that William was far from the kind of person who could understand the pain he carried. The police, like the justice system, was just a cog in a flawed system that would never reach the powerful. On a cold night, after one of his observations of Blackwell's mansion, Elliot meets with Miriam, a young seamstress who works for the city's wealthy families, greets him with a kind smile, something rare in Elliot's daily life. She observes him for a while and notices that something is wrong with the boy. Miriam, who is also an orphan and has spent her life struggling against poverty, is drawn to the pain she perceives in Elliot. Elliot, though hesitant, eventually talks to her. He didn't know much about Miriam, but she seemed different from the others, more understanding perhaps. She listened attentively as he spoke about Blackwell and his desire for justice, or rather, revenge. Miriam tries in every way to explain to Elliot that revenge would not bring him peace. She believed that even with the injustice of the system, there was a chance to change things, even if it was difficult and time-consuming. But Elliot wouldn't listen. His anger, fueled by loss and suffering, was stronger than any words of comfort. The idea that justice could be achieved by himself alone, without anyone's help, began to consume his mind. He didn't want to wait. He wanted action. And more than ever, He believed that the only way to alleviate his pain was to bring the man who caused his loss to justice by any means necessary. Do you believe it's possible to seek justice on your own when the system fails, or by acting on our own? Might we end up getting lost in our own desires for revenge? The city of Philadelphia, still shrouded in the cold of winter, seemed to Elliot like a prison of concrete and indifference. As luxury carriages sped through the snow-covered streets, the boy felt increasingly detached from the life unfolding around him. The feeling that the world continued to turn without noticing his suffering, without questioning the injustices he endured, made his heart ache. He, who had lost everything, now sought answers in the shadows. His gaze lingered on details that went unnoticed by others, such as the movement of the curtains in Blackwell's mansion, or the servants who hurried in and out of his house. Each of those gestures seemed to be a piece of the puzzle that Elliot believed he could solve. But the closer he got to the mansion, the more he realized that the clues were unclear, and that perhaps he was losing himself in an illusion. Despite his growing frustration, life in St. Anne went on. The orphanage, a dark and cold building, was where Elliot spent his nights. The other orphans seemed to accept the routine with resignation, but he couldn't. A feeling of powerlessness gnawed at him from the inside. He didn't want to be just another face on the shelves of the adoption system, waiting to be chosen. He wanted answers. He wanted justice, or at least revenge. The figure of Miriam, the young seamstress he had met days before, wouldn't leave his mind. She was different from everyone else he had ever met. Her compassion seemed genuine, but her belief in the goodness of the justice system deeply troubled him. Elliot knew that the system, with all its pomp and ceremony, would never reach those responsible for the tragedies that had marked his life. Injustice, for him, was a constant, and there was no room for naivete. That afternoon, after another day observing Blackwell, Elliot meets with William Hayes, his old childhood friend, who had now become a police officer. The reunion, though unexpected, was not pleasant. William, in his impeccable uniform, seemed even more distant from the boy who had once been his friend. The conversation between them was tense, and Elliot couldn't help but feel a mixture of anger and sadness at seeing how William, now part of the system he so despised, seemed so oblivious to the suffering of the less fortunate. "You must understand, Elliot," William said. "What you are doing is not justice. It is not the right way." And his voice was calm but firm, as if he had seen too much to believe that something like revenge could have any value. Elliot, his eyes burning with frustration, retorted, "And you, William, you're part of this too, aren't you? Just another pawn in this game. They have the money, the power, and the control, and what do we have? Only what's left of our lives." The argument remained unresolved. William tried, with cautious words, to persuade Elliot to abandon his quest for revenge, saying he had too much to lose, but Elliot was no longer willing to listen. He had already decided that the only way to achieve justice would be with his own hands. The rest of the world could be mistaken, but he knew the truth lay hidden somewhere, and he would do whatever it took to find it. That night, after parting ways with William, Elliot met again with Miriam in the central square. She once again watched him with silent concern, as if trying to understand the torment that consumed him. She, who knew the pain of loss, still believed that hope could be restored. Miriam tried once more to persuade him to abandon his solitary quest, but this time Elliot was unyielding. Anger and the desire for justice had already become stronger than any reason. "You don't understand," said Elliot, his eyes fixed on the floor, as if trying to hide the pain that still tore at him. "I need to do this. I need to find the answer, and if justice doesn't come from outside, it will come from within me." Miriam sighed deeply, realizing that, at that moment, words wouldn't be enough to change Elliot's mind. She could only watch as he continued down a path that took him further and further away from the chance of redemption. "And you? Do you believe that in the face of so much injustice, anyone has the right to take justice into their own hands? Or does that only end up creating more pain? The days in Philadelphia were beginning to drag on toward the end of winter. But for Elliot, the snow would never melt. The weight of his quest, which consumed him day after day, only increased. He could no longer distinguish the line between reason and the irrational desire for revenge. Each step he took toward Blackwell's mansion, each movement he observed, seemed to give him more certainties and at the same time more doubts. Your relationship with Miriam, he distanced himself with each conversation. She tried in every way to show him that what he was doing wouldn't bring him peace, but Elliot no longer wanted to listen. To him, she didn't understand the depth of his pain, the loss of his parents, the feeling that no one would ever be held accountable. He no longer wanted to believe that the system could correct what was wrong. The evidence that justice was failing was in his own heart, in every empty look he exchanged with the other orphans. They were invisible to the world. Meanwhile, the search for Jonathan Blackwell continued. Elliot spent hours around Blackwell's mansion, hidden in the shadows, trying to see something, hear something that would be a clue to guilt. But the man seemed to live in a world apart, isolated from the reality of the streets. His businesses flourished, and he seemed untouched by the misery that gripped the city. However, Elliot was certain that something was wrong. He felt, in every fiber of his being, that there was a secret hidden somewhere. Elliot remembered the stories he'd heard as a child, stories of how power and money corrupt even the strongest souls. He knew Blackwell was involved in something sinister. But what exactly? A man so powerful would never leave easy clues, that much was clear. However, the need to find an explanation for the fire that had destroyed his life blinded him. The pain left no room for doubt. On a cold afternoon, when the city was shrouded in a thick fog, Elliot had the opportunity to enter Blackwell's mansion. He didn't know how, but he had managed to infiltrate the property, hiding among the trees in the garden, and was now inside the house. What he found there was quite different from what he had imagined. The mansion was not only large and luxurious, but also dark and full of empty corridors, as if it hid ancient secrets. He approached a room where, by chance, he heard voices. Blackwell was there, talking to one of his associates. Elliot stood behind a half-open door, listening to the conversation. The words he heard, however, were not what he expected. Blackwell wasn't talking about coal or iron deals, but about a much more sinister project. He mentioned something about safe investments and how some bodies disappear without a trace. The mention of disappearing bodies made Elliot's heart race. He didn't know if it was related to the fire at his house, but it was clear that Blackwell was involved in something far darker than he had imagined. Now, more than ever, Elliot was convinced that Blackwell knew more than he was letting on. He had something to do with the fire. But what? And how could he prove it? The secret Blackwell was trying to hide seemed more dangerous than he could have imagined. But something inside Elliot began to change. With each new piece of information, the weight of the truth became more unbearable. He knew he was sinking deeper into an endless abyss, that his obsession with revenge was distancing him further and further from his humanity. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't give up now. Each fragment of truth he uncovered seemed to push him even deeper into the conflict. He didn't know what would be harder, facing the truth about Blackwell or about himself. That night, as he left the mansion, his thoughts clouded, and feeling further away from any solution, Elliot came across William Hayes again. The policeman, now once more in his imposing uniform, seemed to have sensed that something was wrong, something out of the ordinary. "I know what you're doing, Elliot," said William, his voice deep but not without a hint of concern. "I know what you think you're finding, but it's not going to get you anywhere. You're sinking into a lie, and you're going to lose everything because of it." Elliot glared at William with intense anger. "Do you still think justice will prevail? That the system will fix this?" "I've seen enough, William. You don't understand. They have the power. I have nothing, only my anger. And that's enough." William stepped forward, trying to meet Elliot's eyes. "And what will happen then, Elliot, if you get what you want? What will you do with it?" Elliot's response was silent. He didn't know, but anger still consumed him, and he couldn't stop. "Do you believe that when we are blinded by anger, we can lose our humanity in the process? How far do you think someone can go in pursuit of revenge before losing themselves completely?" As winter gave way to the first flowers of spring, Elliot found himself increasingly entangled in his quest. His gaze had become sharper, his mind more focused. He could no longer discern where truth ended and vengeance began. What had once seemed a mission of justice was now a nightmare, and he no longer knew how to escape it. The meeting with William Hayes, this only strengthened his conviction that no one but himself could do anything. Elliot felt that, as he approached a crucial revelation, the people around him tried to divert him from his path, as if the system wanted to keep him away from his own truth. He no longer believed in the police, nor in anyone who tried to reason with him about the right way to do things. The only thing left was an obsession, a blind search for the answer he believed could bring peace back to his life. Miriam on the other hand, she was beginning to realize that she couldn't change Elliot's mindset. She still loved him, but his dedication to this insane quest seemed increasingly distant from the boy she had spoken to months ago. She knew that what he was looking for couldn't be found in some dark corner of a mansion, nor in any conversation about a distant fire. The real issue, she understood, wasn't what had happened in the past, but what was happening to Elliot now. She began to distance herself, not because she didn't love him, but because she realized he was becoming unrecognizable. The conversations that once had a touch of hope were now filled with bitterness. Miriam tried unsuccessfully to find a way to make Elliot see that revenge, ultimately, would never resolve the pain he carried. She knew he needed help, but at the same time she could no longer see where he had lost his way. About that, Jonathan Blackwell. He continued his life unaware of what was about to happen. He was still immersed in his own interests and concerns, a man who, deep down, didn't see the damage he was causing. For him, the world would always be a game where he held the right cards. However, with each passing day, Elliot drew closer to what he believed to be the truth, and the discovery, which until then had remained a mystery, now seemed within his grasp. During one of his meetings with the Blackwell Mansion's employees, Elliot noticed something peculiar. While they were arguing amongst themselves, one of the servants spoke of a deal Blackwell had supposedly made with an investor, someone from the government, someone who might have interfered in the fire investigation. Elliot, his mind still clouded by anger, couldn't distinguish whether this was real or just another fragment of a story he was inventing to justify himself. These new snippets of information made him feel like he was about to discover something big. But at the same time, a feeling of fear grew inside him. He knew that by exposing the truth, he would also be exposing himself. The anger that had driven him until now was beginning to mix with the fear of what he might find. Miriam. In her quest to better understand Elliot's grief, she began talking to other townspeople. She had learned of an old fire on a Blackwell property, years before the fire that destroyed Elliot's life. Although the stories were shrouded in rumor, there was something there that made Miriam believe she had to dig deeper. She knew the truth could be a double-edged sword. Perhaps it was a truth that could save Elliot, or perhaps it was something that would drag him into an even deeper abyss. Meanwhile, the police, led by William Hayes, he continued to investigate Blackwell's business dealings. Although the investigation was ongoing, nothing seemed to be progressing. The system was closed, entangled in its own bureaucracy, and Elliot didn't believe any significant action would come of it. Elliot was at a critical point. His actions were increasingly driven by anger, despair, and the belief that justice would never come without his intervention. But at the same time, he found himself more isolated. The people around him were distancing themselves, not out of malice, but because they saw that he was losing his way. The path he was taking now seemed further from any true resolution than he had imagined. Revenge, which had previously seemed his only answer, was beginning to feel empty and pointless. Yet in his mind, a spark of hope still lingered. If he could find the truth, everything could change. But was this truly the end he sought, or was he merely sinking deeper into his own despair? When we distance ourselves from the people we love in the name of something greater, like revenge, what do we lose in the process? Is there any point of return, or is the damage irreparable? The icy wind cut through the streets of Philadelphia, but Elliot no longer felt the cold. His mind was consumed by the relentless search for answers. Every piece of information, every whisper about Blackwell, led him to an inevitable destination. He was on the verge of a revelation, but as he drew closer to the truth, something inside him began to unravel. The line between right and wrong was becoming more blurred, and anger, his only guide until then, was beginning to become his greatest enemy. Everything began to crumble that night. Elliot had spent days observing the movements of Blackwell and his associates, trying to piece together the puzzle. He felt he was about to discover something crucial, something that, he believed, would finally bring justice to his life. But what he discovered was something he never expected. The fire that destroyed his home had not been just an accident, but part of a much larger scheme involving large-scale political and financial interests. Blackwell's name was somehow linked to this web of corruption, but there was something more, something he couldn't comprehend. That night, infiltrating Blackwell's mansion again, Elliot found a hidden file in a private office. It was a set of documents that seemed not only to confirm Blackwell's involvement in the fire, but also to point to a scheme of bribery and manipulation of authorities. It was more than Elliot had imagined. He knew he couldn't leave without taking everything he found. This would be his chance to finally expose the truth. But something inside him was already beginning to hesitate. As he prepared to leave the mansion, Elliot heard footsteps approaching. His heart raced. He was about to be caught. But to his surprise, it wasn't Blackwell who appeared in the room. It was William Hayes. Elliot froze, surprised and confused. How did he know where he was? How had he gotten there? William looked at him, unsurprised, but with a heavy look of understanding. "I knew you were getting closer to the truth, Elliot, and I knew that when that happened, you wouldn't be the same anymore." His voice was deep, full of a tone Elliot had never imagined hearing from a friend. Elliot, documents in hand, took a step back, trying to escape. But William stopped him. "You don't understand, do you? Everything you're doing, this whole path you're following, will destroy you. You're not the only one who's lost someone. You're not the only one who's suffered. But this isn't how you do justice. Are you on their side, William? Did you betray me too?" Elliot's anger suddenly exploded. He could no longer cope with William's words. He could no longer accept the idea that he, as a police officer, was somehow on Blackwell's side. "You're protecting him, aren't you? I have proof. I can finally put an end to this. I will destroy Blackwell." William looked into Elliot's eyes, and for a moment Elliot saw not an enemy, but a lost friend. Someone who understood his pain, but was trapped in his own web of duty and obligation. "Elliot, you have no idea what you're getting yourself into. Blackwell isn't the only one to blame. There's something much bigger at stake here, and if you continue, you'll lose yourself completely." William's words were a direct blow to Elliot's chest. He was so focused on a single person, a single face, that he couldn't see the bigger picture. Blackwell, in his mind, was solely responsible for his pain, for his loss, for everything he had lived through. But now, faced with that revelation, Elliot was beginning to realize that things weren't as simple as he had imagined. He looked at the documents in his hands, and the truth began to take shape before him, but with an unexpected weight. What he had found not only compromised Blackwell, but also many other people who, like him, were simply trying to survive. but who were involved in something much larger and more complex than he could understand. What at first seemed to be personal revenge, now transformed into a tangled web of corruption that involved much more than simple injustice. Elliot felt the weight of responsibility falling on his shoulders. He no longer knew what to do with the truth he now possessed. The anger still burned within him, but there was a part of his soul that knew his quest had changed forever. He was becoming something he could no longer control, something he didn't know if he could forgive himself for. William, seeing Elliot's internal struggle, made a move toward the boy, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I know you want to do this, but what will happen afterward? What will you do when the truth comes out? Are you prepared for the consequences?" Elliot looked at the papers, then at William, and for the first time realized that the real struggle was not in what he was doing against Blackwell, but within himself. "When we are on the verge of discovering the truth, do you think it would set us free or just drag us further into an endless abyss? How do we deal with the responsibility of such a great discovery?" The following morning brought no relief to Elliot. He had woken with the same thoughts that had consumed him for weeks, but now everything seemed different. The weight of the truth had settled on his chest in a way he didn't know how to handle. What he held in his hands, the documents compromising Blackwell and others, was not just an isolated clue. It was a bomb about to explode, and Elliot didn't know if he was prepared for the consequences of that explosion. He walked the streets of Philadelphia like a man searching for something he didn't know what it was. The steps that had once guided him with blind determination now felt heavy and hesitant. Anger still burned in his soul, but there was a new kind of fear, a fear he hadn't felt before, the fear of the truth, the fear of knowing too much, the fear that his actions might cause irreparable harm. Elliot knew he could no longer turn back. The decision to expose Blackwell and the others had been made, but the ramifications terrified him. What would happen when the truth was revealed? He no longer knew if he could live with the consequences of his choices. The anger that had driven him this far now seemed like a flame slowly dying out, replaced by an existential void. What did he hope to achieve? Revenge? Justice? Or was it simply the satisfaction of having put an end to something that had consumed him for so long? He met once again with William Hayes. The policeman had tried in every way to convince Elliot that there were other ways to handle the situation, other ways to achieve justice without destroying himself. But now, looking at William, Elliot saw only a reflection of what he could have become. Someone who chose to follow the rules, someone who sacrificed himself for order, but who, in a way, had lost himself in the process. "You knew, didn't you?" Elliot asked, his voice strained. "You knew all of this. You knew Blackwell was involved with the government, that he was manipulating everything behind the scenes." William didn't answer immediately. He seemed to weigh each word before speaking, as if trying to find a way to tell Elliot what he didn't want to hear. "I know you're angry, Elliot, and I understand. I understand how you feel. But anger won't bring you peace, and you know that." Elliot looked at him, his eyes filled with frustration. "I don't know anything anymore, William. Nothing I thought was true is real. And now, with everything I've discovered, what do I do? Do you think the police will act fairly? Do you think that, after all this, anyone will really pay for everything that happened? I'm just a child, William, and none of this will change." William looked at Elliot with a look of genuine pain. "Elliot, if you continue down this path, you won't be yourself anymore. You'll lose yourself searching for something that, deep down, will never give you the peace you seek. I know it's difficult. I know you're trying to do what you think is right, but justice isn't a burden you should carry alone." These words echoed in Elliot's mind, but he wasn't ready to hear them. He didn't want to wait any longer. He didn't want to depend on a system he saw as corrupt and detached. For him now, there was only one thing to do: expose the truth, expose everything he knew, and make those responsible pay. But he didn't know until that moment that exposing the truth could be more destructive than any lie. In the following days, as Elliot prepared to reveal what he knew, he was confronted by Miriam. She hadn't spoken to him since the day she found him at Blackwell's mansion, but she knew something had changed. Miriam found him in the alley where he used to hide to watch the mansion, and there, under the dim light of a lamppost, she looked into his eyes, trying to see beyond the anger that consumed him. "Elliot," she began with a gentleness he hadn't expected. "I know what you're doing. I know you've found something. I know you're determined to move forward, but I need you to know that even if all of this is true, it won't bring you what you hope for. You'll destroy yourself if you continue like this." Elliot looked at her with a coldness that made her recoil. "You don't understand, Miriam. There's nothing more to be done. The truth is here, before us, and someone needs to pay for it. Someone needs to pay for everything they've done." "That's not how life works," Miriam said, her voice choked with emotion, her concern evident. "Do you think that by revealing all this, you'll feel relief, you'll feel justice? You're so focused on destroying Blackwell that you don't realize you're destroying yourself in the process. And what will happen when all this is over, Elliot? When there's nothing left but the pain you've carried your whole life?" Elliot looked at her for a long moment, but couldn't find an answer. Deep down, he knew she was right, but the rage burning inside him wouldn't let him accept it. He wanted someone held accountable. He wanted that man, that monster he believed Blackwell to be, to finally be exposed. He no longer knew if he was acting out of justice, revenge, or simply the need to end the pain that consumed him. The truth was before him, but it didn't seem to be the answer he was searching for. When we cling so tightly to anger and pain, do you think we can see true justice, or in the end, do we just end up losing our way? The days that followed were the darkest Elliot had ever experienced. He knew his life was about to change irreversibly. The revelation he held in his hands was not only a key to unmasking Blackwell's corruption, but also a distorted reflection of everything he had become. A man seeking revenge, blinded by grief, unable to see the damage he was causing himself and others. As the day of his great revelation drew closer, Elliot isolated himself more and more, not only physically, but emotionally. The presence of William Hayes and Miriam it no longer affected him in the same way. He viewed them with disdain, as if they were the last vestiges of a past he wished to erase. The desire to expose Blackwell, to destroy the person who, according to him, was responsible for his pain, consumed all his thoughts. But something inside Elliot began to change. One day, while walking down the street, he passed a mirror in a shop window. For a moment, he stopped and looked at himself. The man looking back was no longer that innocent boy who, before the fire, dreamed of a better life. The reflection he saw was that of someone marked by pain, someone who had lost everything, but who had also lost himself in the process. The rage that had once driven him now felt like poison inside his body, corroding every piece of his humanity. He was about to make a decision that would change his life forever. But at that moment, his eyes fixed on his reflection, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a profound doubt. What was he doing? What did he really want? However, even though this doubt shook him, the anger was still present. It wouldn't leave him in peace, whispering in his ears that he had to move on, that the only way to find peace was to destroy the one who had caused his suffering. That's when he had an unexpected encounter. Miriam, once again, she found him alone, trying to organize his thoughts, or rather, his chaotic emotions. She didn't say anything immediately, just approached and stood beside him, speechless. After a long silence, she said with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the turmoil raging inside him, "Elliot, I know how much you're suffering. I know you've lost everything, but you don't have to continue like this. The pain you carry won't disappear with revenge. It will only consume you even more." He looked at her, his eyes filled with anguish. "But what else can I do? How can I move on, knowing that no one will pay for everything that happened? How can I continue living knowing that Blackwell is getting away with it? Miriam looked at him tenderly, but also with a strength he had never imagined finding in her. The answer isn't in destroying someone, Elliot. True strength lies in overcoming pain and choosing a different path, even when everything around you screams to follow the path of revenge. Elliot swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. He was so focused on destroying Blackwell that he couldn't see the destruction he himself was causing. What was he doing anyway? He was about to plunge into an abyss of pain and regret, and if he did, nothing he achieved would be enough to repair what he had lost. He looked at Miriam, his eyes softer now, as if a part of him was finally listening to what she was saying. I don't know what to do anymore, Miriam. I feel like I've lost the ability to feel anything other than anger. Miriam smiled softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. I understand. But you are not the anger you feel. You are so much more than that. And you can be more than this weight you carry. At that moment, Elliot finally began to understand what she meant. He no longer needed to be the boy hiding in the shadows, seeking revenge as if it were the only thing that could bring him peace. He could be something more. He could choose a new way of living, a way in which pain was no longer his guide, but his ability to move forward. The decision was before him, to go ahead with the revelation, destroy Blackwell and lose himself in the process, or to leave the anger behind, look to the future and find a way to rebuild what he had lost. He knew that neither decision would be easy, but finally he realized that he had the power to choose. Elliot didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt there was a path ahead. It wouldn't be an easy one, but it would be the only one that could allow him to heal. True victory wouldn't be destroying Blackwell, but saving himself from his own pain. When we find ourselves consumed by pain and anger, how can we recover our humanity? What is necessary to choose a path of healing instead of revenge? The following days were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Elliot had decided he would not follow the path of revenge. He knew that anger still burned within him, but he also knew that if he didn't control it, it would consume him completely. He would no longer be that boy who sought only destruction. Now, he wanted justice, not just for himself, but for all those who had been affected by Blackwell's corruption and everything he represented. But the choice not to act impulsively was not easy. With each step, Elliot felt the weight of responsibility growing upon him. He knew that by making this decision, many people would expect him to deliver justice in another way. Some expected a quick fix, immediate punishment. But for Elliot, true justice was not just making Blackwell pay for his crimes, but also breaking the cycle of pain and revenge that had begun years ago. He started working alongside William Hayes and some of the other police officers who were involved in the investigation, sharing the information he had gathered. But there was something different about his approach. He no longer wanted to be the man behind the revenge. He wanted to be the key to change, someone who could somehow right the wrongs without succumbing to the desire to destroy. The tension in the city was palpable. While Blackwell's investigations progressed slowly, Elliot felt that time was running out. He knew he couldn't wait forever. Blackwell was still there, like a shadow over the city, his actions uncontrollable, his political and economic alliances more powerful than anyone could imagine. But Elliot was determined to maintain his integrity. He refused to be manipulated by the anger that still tried to dominate his thoughts. He didn't know if, in the end, he would be able to stop Blackwell. But now his mission was more than simply destroying him. He wanted to ensure his truth was heard, that the city knew who Blackwell really was. He wanted to make a difference, not only for himself, but for all the others who had suffered at the hands of the powerful man. However, his decision to act more cautiously came at a price. Miriam Shee, who had always supported him, now saw him in a different light. She had been with him up to that point, But her own feelings were beginning to shift. She saw Elliot's inner struggle, and the weight of the choices he made seemed to be driving them apart. She knew he had changed, but she also knew that change wasn't something he could completely control. He was drifting away, not only from her, but from everything they had built together. Elliot felt the loss, but didn't fully understand it. He was caught between two worlds, that of a boy who wanted justice and the reality that to obtain it, he would have to make sacrifices he wasn't sure he was willing to make. Then, the inevitable happened. The pressure on Blackwell mounted as the investigations deepened and the revelations began to hit critical points. The truth that Elliot and William had been building was about to be exposed. The system was about to confront the monster Blackwell had created, and Elliot knew that when that happened, there would be no turning back. The moment he had dreaded was approaching. He found himself at an impasse, certain that by finally confronting Blackwell and exposing his crimes, he could no longer return to what he was before. Anger wasn't entirely absent from his heart, but he finally understood that it was possible to redirect it towards something more meaningful. He knew the city was on the verge of change, but that it could come at a high cost. Blackwell was still powerful, still had allies, and his network of influence was vast. But Elliot was no longer alone. He now had allies, people willing to fight for what was right. As the investigations neared a critical point, Elliot felt ready, not for revenge, but for something more important, for justice. Not simple justice, not the justice he had sought with clenched fists and a burning heart. It was justice done with patience, with truth, with the understanding that revenge had never been the true answer. Now the city was about to learn the truth, and with it the chance to begin healing its own wounds. But what would happen to Elliot after that? Would the truth set him free or leave him even more lost? When we face what we fear, can we truly control the consequences of our actions? How can we prepare for change when we know it will be inevitable? The sound of Elliot's footsteps echoed through the silent Philadelphia night. The destiny he had chosen led him to this point, where the line between right and wrong blurred, where justice and vengeance mingled in a way he had never imagined. Now, with the truth in his hands, he knew that exposing Blackwell would only be the beginning. He couldn't erase the pain he carried, but at least he could ensure the city finally knew who he truly was. Elliot and William Hayes. They had worked tirelessly in recent days. The investigation into Blackwell was about to explode. The connections between him and the highest echelons of politics, the bribes, the manipulations he had orchestrated over the years, were being revealed one by one. But that wasn't enough for Elliot. It wasn't enough just to unmask Blackwell. He wanted to see that man pay, really pay. He wanted to see him face justice, hear the words he had always imagined hearing, see the prison he always thought he deserved. That night, Elliot knew he would finally have the chance to confront Blackwell directly. The evidence was gathered, the operation was underway, and the police were prepared to deliver the final blow. But at the same time, a sense of uncertainty began to creep over him. He knew that moment would change everything, but he didn't know if he was prepared to deal with the consequences of his own actions. He entered Blackwell's mansion, now with a newfound confidence. He was no longer the inexperienced young man who had lurked in the shadows, seeking revenge. He knew what he was doing now. His presence in the mansion was a declaration that he no longer cared what would happen. Revenge was no longer his goal, but the exposure of the truth. Miriam, he appeared just as he was about to confront Blackwell. His expression was worried, but there was also a hint of hope. Elliot, are you sure you want to do this? Tonight will change everything. After this, there will be no turning back. Elliot looked at her, feeling the weight of his words. I have no other choice, Miriam. If I don't do this, he will continue destroying lives, and I will just be another victim. I'm stronger than this. I can do this. Miriam sighed, unable to hide her concern. I know you want justice, Elliot, but sometimes justice isn't so simple. Sometimes it can be more painful than you imagine." Elliot didn't answer. He was silent, but he felt something inside him, something pulling him back towards doubt, but he couldn't turn back anymore. He had come this far, and the only thing left to do was continue. The confrontation with Blackwell took place in his office, the place where all the schemes had been hatched, where the threads of corruption had been woven for years. Blackwell was there, as always, with his arrogant smile, thinking that nothing could touch him. "Elliot, my young friend," Blackwell said, watching the boy enter, "you finally did it. I must say I was impressed by your persistence. But this won't change anything. I'm stronger than you think." Elliot, documents in hand, stepped forward. "You never understood, Blackwell. I didn't come here just to expose you. I came to make sure you pay for what you did, that you pay for the lives you destroyed, for the pain you caused." Blackwell smiled disdainfully. "You think you can stop me? You think a simple revelation will change anything? I have allies, I have power. I have everything I need to get away with this. You can't stop me." But at that moment, something in Elliot transformed. He felt a wave of clarity, as if the entire weight of his journey had culminated there, in that instant. The anger, though still present, was no longer the fuel that moved him. The truth now was the only power he possessed. He knew that despite everything, it wasn't Blackwell who was in control. It was him. The control lay in the ability to expose the truth, not to destroy it. "You're wrong," Elliot said firmly. "I'm not here to destroy you. I'm here to expose who you really are. And that, Blackwell, is what will destroy you." With a swift movement, Elliot handed the documents to Blackwell, revealing all the schemes, the bribes, the political manipulations he had orchestrated. He knew this was the final blow. He no longer needed to take justice into his own hands. The truth was now his weapon, and it would be more powerful than any revenge. Blackwell stared at the papers, his eyes narrowing. He knew there was no escape anymore. The truth had come out. There was nowhere left to hide. When the police entered the room, led by William Hayes, Blackwell was immediately arrested. The man who had manipulated the city for so long was finally being taken away. But even with Blackwell's arrest, Elliot felt no relief. He didn't feel the satisfaction he had imagined. Instead, he felt a weight, a mixture of feelings he didn't know how to process. The victory hadn't been sweet. When we reach the end of a journey in search of justice, what truly remains for us? The satisfaction of having done what is right, or the emptiness of knowing that nothing will ever be the same again? Blackwell's arrest was just the beginning of a significant change in Philadelphia. The city, which had been dominated by corruption and fear for so long, began to breathe a little more freely. But for Elliot, the feeling of victory was almost non-existent. He could no longer feel the satisfaction he had hoped for. Even with the imprisonment of the man who had caused him so much pain, something inside him remained empty. Elliot looked at the city, observing the streets that had once been his refuge. Freedom was there, but it wasn't the same freedom he had imagined. The weight of truth, of justice, of the pain he carried seemed to have become even heavier. He knew what he had done was right, but the price of his decision left its mark on him. He had confronted Blackwell, exposed the truth, and made what he considered the hardest choice of his life. But looking back, he realized that although he had destroyed a monster, he hadn't resolved the pain he carried inside. What remained now? Elliot knew that from that moment on, the city would begin to rebuild itself. The scars left by Blackwell and his crimes would be difficult to erase, but at least now people would have a chance to start over. But for him, rebuilding his own life was still a hazy and uncertain path. Miriam, who had stayed by his side throughout the journey, also seemed different. She was there, by his side, but something had broken between them. They knew that the relationship they had before the fire would never be the same, but nevertheless, she was willing to walk alongside Elliot as he tried to find himself again. "You did what you had to do, Elliot," Miriam whispered. "You did what no one else dared to do. But now, what are you going to do with it?" Elliot looked at her, his eyes filled with doubt. "I don't know. I don't know how to move on, Miriam. I think there's only one thing left. Learning to live with what's left." Miriam touched his hand, offering him silent comfort, but there were no promises. The truth was out, and the city was beginning to rise. But for Elliot, what truly mattered now was finding a path for himself, a path not guided by pain or revenge, but by the pursuit of peace. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that the scars would never completely disappear, but now he had something he didn't have before, the ability to choose his future. And that, however small, was the beginning of his true freedom. After the battle ends and justice is served, what is the true price we pay? What remains for us when the shadows of the past finally begin to fade? Months after Blackwell's arrest, Philadelphia was in the process of recovery. The shadows of corruption began to slowly dissipate, and people began to rebuild their lives. Elliot, though still marked by the scars of the past, found a new purpose. He knew the road to healing would be long and difficult, but he was willing to move forward. Miriam, by his side, also began to rebuild herself, though with a heart full of uncertainty. Together they looked to the future, knowing that while the past could not be erased, a new beginning was within reach. When the future calls us, should we move forward with hope or remain trapped by our scars? How do you face the challenge of starting over after a major trauma? Elliot's journey was long and full of challenges, but the real struggle begins when pain becomes the fuel for a new beginning. And you? Have you ever experienced moments that tested your courage or your values? How do you deal with the weight of difficult choices? Share your reflections in the comments below and tell us how Elliot's story resonated with your life. If you were touched by this journey, be sure to share it with your friends and follow more stories like this. Together, we can explore what it truly means to overcome our greatest obstacles.